I got to beat. I've seen it 6. So, for those who haven't seen the movie yet, and for those who have seen it and just want a little refresher, let's take a quick look at the clip from the trailer.
Equilateral, trapezoid, isosceles, tetrahedron.
Have you never seen a mind like the one your daughter has? You have to see what she becomes.
Come on! Move like that.
Catherine, we all gonna end up unemployed riding around in this power.
Jump, you welcome to walk the 16 miles.
Oh, I'll sit in the back of the bus.
Kiss me up!
You have identification on?
We're just on our way to work.
And that's what's up.
I had no idea they hired.
There are quite a few women working in the space program.
You know what we're doing here? We're putting a human on top of a missile, shooting him into space, and it's never been done before.
So, as a historian, I'm obliged to point out that while the movie is based on actual events, and it's got that little disclaimer at the beginning of the movie, it is not a documentary. So there are a number of factors in the movie that are not historically accurate, but many of those aspects that were dramatized for the film were done to make the key points of the film fit into the film. It's a film that's based in 1961 and 62, and the race and gender issues that these women faced weren't solved as quickly or as easily as shown in the film that quick period there. I think the film is really true to the struggles of the main characters in the movie, so I think it tells us something about the people at the center of the story. But we'll talk a little bit more about them and about the movie in a little bit. First, I'll do what historians are supposed to do, which is provide some context. Right? What is it that led to women computers working at Langley at the time? What is a human computer? What did they do? Why do we have them? That story, for our purposes, starts here at Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory. That's shown pictured in the air from the mid-1930s. There are tremendous successes of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in the 1920s and early 1930s, led to a huge growth. In fact, in this picture, you can see on the upper right side there, construction going on with tow tanks and the sort of other test facilities out there. Rapid growth, but still, there were only about 400 people working at Langley until about 1937. They finally broke the 400 mark. It changed dramatically after the war started. But one of the problems facing the engineers in the 1930s was that there was too much work to do. As usual, all these new facilities coming online, wind tunnels, tow tanks, there's flight test data from planes flying off Langley Field. And there's all this new data, and even just gathering the data was extremely time consuming, and then of course cranking through the numbers and coming to some conclusions from that data took a fair amount of time. Now, this audience, I'm sure most of you are familiar with what the old wind tunnels look like. So many of you may not be as familiar with what down below underneath the wind tunnels look like, which is this. This is a picture from below one of the wind tunnels at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory. And this is actually literally how they measured the forces on objects in the wind tunnels. They're connected by connecting rods to actual scales. And people had to sit there and write down what the readings were on the scales as time went along. So gathering data took a fair amount of time. And then of course you had to calculate all that data as well. In 1935, it was finally decided that they needed to do something about this problem, and they tried a little experiment, as was intended, hiring computers to do this work. They initially brought in just 5 of them in the summer of 1935. Now, there's a long tradition of computers doing work, of this sort. In fact, it was a civil service job title. It wasn't a piece of equipment in the 1930s. A computer was a human being with that job title. That work dates back probably most notably to the work of astronomers in the 19th century. And it was traditionally the work of women. That they did the work calculations, and the scientists and astronomers got to write the papers and talk about how wonderful their work was. The idea of hiring women to be computers at Langley actually did have some opposition. There were some people who didn't like the idea very much, and most of the people who didn't like the idea very much were engineers. And the reason they didn't like the idea very much wasn't because they didn't want women in the workplace so much. It was because they were afraid that their equipment budgets would be clobbered by these women computers coming in and wanting calculators. The mechanical calculators were pretty expensive at the time, and they were afraid that would impact their work budget. The opposition of engineers didn't last very long. And we know that the experiment was a huge success, and the pool of women computers grew rapidly. And we actually know a fair number of details about this from this memo. From 1942, it came out of our archive. It was a 3.5-page letter from the NACA to the Curtiss Wright Engineering Company. And Curtiss Wright was thinking during the war, this is 1942, they're thinking about setting up their own computer pool, and they knew the NACA had success with it, with having a computer pool. So they wrote to the NACA and said, can you help us out? And they got this very nice letter back. At the time this memo was written, there were about 75 women computers working at Langley. This is, of course, World War II. The number of employees here was about 1,000 in 1942, and about almost half of them, 450 of them, were engineers. But the memo notes, and I'll make a couple quotes here, that the women computers did their work, quote, more rapidly and accurately than the engineers had, and that the women did more computing in a morning than engineers could finish in an entire day. So what is it that the women computers do? There were really sort of two categories of work that people who had the job title computer did. One of those things was gathering the data from those scales that I showed earlier, but later on, as the Langley staff got smarter about how to do things. In fact, this is one of the things that I think we've overlooked oftentimes when we think about what happened at Langley in the 20s and 30s. Not only did we generate all this data that now is the basis of aeronautics as we now know it, but the engineers, scientists, the technicians actually built and devised the technologies for doing this work. Right? Built the tools and techniques we needed to do aeronautical research. So one of those things was using film cameras, for example, to capture those readings rather than having human beings stand there and write down the numbers. And eventually, they developed all kinds of interesting tools like this manometer board, which is shown here. I think one of the Senate directors mentioned that they worked on a manometer board early in their career. It was actually, basically, those of you who don't know, manometer board, there's a bunch of tubes that went from the object in the test cell, in the test section of the wind tunnel, down to this room, and it could measure, basically they're like thermometers where they measure the pressure on various points on the tunnel. So you can see this woman manually noting what the various pressures were at various points during the test. Now there's a second kind of work, and this is the more complicated work and the more skilled work, and that was actually doing the calculations. This picture here, some of you may have seen this before, but it's a pretty well-known picture of a woman computer at work. She's using a microscope to read the film, because we're saying, a small film, and they're doing these. So she has a microscope to read the film. She's entering the data onto that worksheet there, which tells her what calculations to do with which pieces of data. And then there's that Frieden calculator sitting to her right there, which she then used to do the calculations. Many of the women who held these computer jobs in the late 1930s and at the beginning of the war had degrees in math and other qualifications, so they're very skilled at their work, very effective at it. But the workload at Langley as World War II started grew dramatically. In fact, the work pace was frenetic, and labor was really short. A lot of the men, of course, had gone off to war, so women were hired in to do lots of jobs that they hadn't done before, work jobs formerly held by men. And this helped in fields where men had been the predominant workers, but in fields like computing, where women had done most of the work, there really wasn't another labor pool you could turn to expand, because the work at Langley was growing rapidly and there was a lot to do during World War II. Well, there wasn't that pool. Well, actually, maybe there was a pool. We're not quite sure of the details of how this actually happened, but eventually the personnel office at Langley very quietly, and without a whole lot of documentation, opened the door on the idea of African-American women coming in to serve as computers. Once again, it was sort of a little experiment. They started with 5 people, and this time it was in June of 1943. All the women they brought in had math degrees. Almost all of them were math teachers in the black school system. And they also had a network of contacts of other women like themselves, who worked in the black school system, who had similar skills and motivations and abilities. And they used that network to help recruit follow-on women to work in the West Computing Pool. One of those women was Dorothy Vaughn. Mrs. Vaughn was brought to Langley in December of 1943, so about 6 months after the first African-American woman came in. She was one of the first people to be recruited out of that network. I will point out that her pay as a teacher in the segregated black school system here in Virginia in 1942 was $850 for the year. When she gets hired by the NACA to be a computer, the entry-level pay for a computer was $2,000 a year. So these were really, really good jobs. They paid well, they were challenging and interesting, and the women were very happy to have these jobs and were happy to bring their friends in who were similarly talented. Dorothy herself was brilliant mathematically in her own right, but she was also a great judge of character and a pretty good manager. So when the white supervisor that ran the West Computing Unit came down sick in 1949, Dorothy winds up becoming the acting supervisor. Those of you who've seen the film know that sort of plays out that way. She becomes the acting supervisor, and it takes a long time, a year and 9 months in real life, for the authorities at Langley to finally agree that she actually ought to be the full-time supervisor to take that position. That makes her the first African-American supervisor at Langley, and also one of the very few women in supervisory positions at Langley at the time. But in the movie, this happens in 1961 or 62. In real life, it happened about 10 years earlier, in the early 1950s. Now, some of you, may be thinking that, well, after the war, weren't most of the women sent back to, the home? Guys came back from the war and women went back, and the pace of life slowed down. Well, in reality, at Langley and across the NACA, the other centers, which had now by that time been built, the pace of work actually continues almost at the same level as at World War II, because high-speed research was a critical U.S. national priority. In fact, here's a picture of the crew from Langley with the X-1-2 at what's now Armstrong Flight Research Center. But as a result of this explosion in work in high-speed flight, computers were actually in even more demand. The first electronic computers were starting to appear at this point, but they really weren't very reliable. They were highly expensive, and they were really not very useful. So, as mentioned by the center directors, the habit was we'll check it by hand and we'll do the math ourselves. Now, at that time, and after World War II and into the 1950s, the rules for women in the workplace, I think, were pretty clear. They may have been unwritten, but they're pretty clear. You could work when you were a single young woman. When you got married, particularly when you had children, forget it. You weren't going to be working much anymore. That rule, those set of rules didn't really apply to computers because of their highly skilled status. They got married, no problem. They kept working. They got pregnant. We actually have some evidence in the archives that suggests that some supervisors kind of turned a blind eye to pregnant computers walking around the office until they couldn't avoid it anymore. And they suggested that it was time for them to take some time off. But after women computers would take this time off to have their children, many of them would come back. And they would come back to their old jobs and continue to work at the NACA as computers. One of those people, of course, is another main character in the movie, Garret Jackson, played by Janelle Monáe. She was hired in April of 1951, and after 2 years working in the computing pool, she was permanently assigned to the 4x4 supersonic pressure tunnel to work there. Now, this sort of thing happened frequently. In fact, Margaret Lee Shetterly, the woman who wrote the book Hidden Figures, and I've had many discussions about, how many women actually worked as computers, and we really don't know. Because women would come into the pool and they get pulled out to another job someplace, or they'd leave and then come back after they had their children. So it's really hard to nail down exactly who was, how many there were, never mind what their names were, all of them. Oh, I'm trying to advance my slide. You just give me a click. All right, sorry. Thanks. I should look at the thing down here. I put this here for a reason, but I'm from headquarters, so we run slowly. All right, so as in the movie, we're going to try battery change maybe here. As in the movie, Mary was mentored by an engineer. In her case, in reality, it was a guy named Casimir Zarnicki, and he was from New Bedford, Massachusetts, not from Poland as shown in the movie, but in the two characters, the one in the movie and the one in real life, actually have a lot of similarities there. And Mary did actually have to petition to go to attend graduate school courses at the then segregated Hampton High School. But I think what's really interesting is that in the movie that happens in 1961-62 when the civil rights movement is kind of in movement. In reality, she had to do this in the early 1950s. Long before, civil rights were an issue, probably shortly after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was strongly resisted by the Virginia state government. So I think it's really impressive that she managed to convince somebody to let her go to the segregated Hampton High School to finish her degree. And she did, and she winds up becoming the first black female engineer for us in 1958. Let's see if this works. There we go. All right, so we turn to the third character, known at the time as Catherine Goebel. She was hired by the NACA for the West Computing Pool in June of 1953, almost a decade after Dorothy Vaughn had been hired. And in her case, she didn't stay in the pool long at all. She was only there for 2 weeks. And she got pulled off immediately to the Flight Research Division, where her curiosity, her enthusiasm, her equanimity, and her phenomenal math skills made her a real standout. Now, the Flight Research Division, as many of you probably know, winds up being the spawn, the pool for where the Space Task Group comes out of. And so, Catherine, by this point, Catherine Johnson, winds up working with the Space Task Group, computing the trajectories for the suborbital Mercury flights, and then works on the math for the first orbital flights with the engineer that she worked with, Ted Skupinski. And they wound up publishing a paper in 1960. I'll give you the official title: Determination of Azimuth Angle and Burnout for Placing a Satellite Over a Selected Earth Position. And you can find that in NTRS, by the way. There's a NASA Technical Reports review. You can actually go look up and find that report. It's still in there. And the importance of that report, despite the obscure title, is that it actually laid out the equations that were needed for orbital flight, as is suggested in the movie. One of the questions I get asked frequently about these three characters is, well, why did you hide them? Why were they hidden figures? In Catherine Johnson's case, actually, the interesting thing is she wasn't really very hidden. If you look, the movie folks were asked us for a lot of things, and they were asking for one of the things they were asking for is pictures of these characters, the real people at work. And it was virtually impossible to find a Dorothy Vaughn picture. There's one existing NACA picture of Dorothy Vaughn that we could find, where she appears in a crowd of people at a party, basically. She's kind of off the side. In fact, she's almost not in the picture anymore. And Mary Jackson was almost as hard to find pictures of. But if you look in the archives, the photo archives at Langley, there are a lot of pictures, relatively a lot of pictures of Catherine Johnson at work. And I think a lot of it is because people recognized her particular skills and abilities, and she was sort of known more than the others. So she was never really all that hidden. But on the question of why were they hidden, I've thought about this a lot. And I think there's sort of three overlapping reasons why these African-American women weren't particularly well known at the time. One is that some of the work they were doing, particularly during World War II, but even then during the 50s, some of it was classified work for the military, or was classified for various other national security reasons, right? So they weren't supposed to be talking about what they were doing, number one. Second thing I think is a factor is the sort of generational modesty of the World War II generation. People who survived World War II. My dad was a World War II vet. They just didn't talk about what they did during the war and their contribution. They sort of, you guys know people that age. Some of you are that age. So those people tend to be modest. The third reason, which I don't have a lot of data on, but is a hunch on my part, is that these women who had these good, well-paying jobs were concerned about drawing attention to themselves, being black women in a state where segregation was a law, drawing attention to the fact that I have a good paying job where I work for the federal government. May not have been something they really wanted to do. So I think that may be a factor. So the history is kind of unknown until about actually the early 1990s, when this guy sitting here in front of me, Jim Hansen, who was the historian here at Langley at the time, actually started the initial work on digging into the story about the women computers that worked at Langley during the time. We published a number of papers. There's a small monograph that we put up in the NASA History Program in the late 90s about what women computers did out at what's now Armstrong Flight Research Center. So there's a little bit of work on it, but the actual sort of serious work on the book when it comes to the movie picks up in 2010 when the daughter of Langley atmospheric scientist Margaret Lee Shetterly, comes home for a visit with her husband, and they have this conversation about women computers, and she realizes that this is a story that people don't know about, and it needs to be told. So she starts writing the book. The book was published in September 2016, so it's last fall. And it's actually, the book came out after the movie was already in the can. It was already all filmed. In fact, the movie was optioned off the 55-page book proposal that she had sent to William Morrow, the publisher of the book. So it's kind of an interesting thing. She was involved in some of the work on writing the movie. I'll get my button right here. Okay. So why did NASA get involved? Well, as usual with the movies, it's because they asked. I mean, that's typically why NASA gets involved with Hollywood productions, is because we don't go out and ask them to do stuff. And the more important question may be, why did we say yes? Well, of course, we're proud of our history. This is a particularly good story, so that was a nice story to tell. But more practically speaking, I think the leadership at NASA saw this as a way to inspire young people in a demographic we didn't normally get to. Right? I was 4 years old when John Glenn flew in the flight, and I remember sitting in front of our little black and white TV, worrying about whether John Glenn would get home alive. Man, I was hooked. I wanted to work for NASA from that minute forward. It took me a long time to get here, but nonetheless, that was easy for me to see that. I was a white kid growing up in the suburbs of Boston, white guy. Is okay, I go to the military, I learn how to fly airplanes, I go be a test pilot, and I go be an astronaut. That's how you do that stuff, right? It's pretty clear. If I was a black girl in the Bronx or something, I'd look at it and go, well, that's never going to happen, right? So we're hoping that this movie would appeal to those folks and give them a chance to see that they had an opportunity to rise to their potential, and particularly in math and science, and be a part of our workforce that we need to explore and achieve our mission. I think there's a third reason, though, one that isn't often articulated, is that I think the movie's an inspiration to us adults as well as kids. To help remind us not to rely on prejudices and assumptions we have about the people we work with, and particularly for NASA employees, that remind us of our legacy of inclusion and excellence. I think, as a historian, I can tell you, I think the verdict of NASA's history is pretty clear. What matters is performance, not packaging. What you look like isn't as important as what you do. So, what did NASA do? Well, we consulted on the script. I'm standing here with Ted Melfi on the left. Bert Ulrich, our guy who does Hollywood stuff at headquarters, is between me and Ted. And so we consulted quite a bit on the script, and a lot of people across NASA helped out in lots of different ways. We provided the 20th Century Fox team with lots of pictures. For example, this one here of the Mercury retro rocket pack, which plays an important part in the movie. And the movie guys wanted to have the exact picture of John Glenn's actual retro rocket. So archival photography people, I think here at Langley actually the ones who dug this one up, get those pictures and provided them so that CGI was correct in the film. We also dug up flight plans. Here's a picture of the cover of the flight plan from John Glenn's flight. And I will note that at the bottom, you may not be able to read this, but at the bottom it says, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Manned Spacecraft Center, Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. So, it's an early document there. We also got asked for lots of pictures, particularly pictures of employees at work. And we normally have pictures of hardware. You don't normally get that many pictures of employees at work, so that took a little bit of work to find some of those things. But particularly, they were looking for what people wore. Guards, people in the white room, that they had the name of their company stenciled on the back of the jacket, what did the staff look like, and we even got a request for a picture of what the parking lot at Langley looked like at the time. That one had us stumped for a long time until we saw the movie. And it's like, oh, that's what they wanted, a picture of the parking lot. So the photo lab guys at both headquarters and at the various centers took